This is Aaron Tomlinson. Welcome to Sunday Morning Live. Today I want to continue, excuse me, I'm a little bit froggy this morning. Today I want to continue talking about spiritual gifts as a universal phenomenon, universal capacity. If you missed the past few lives, I've been talking about my experiences as living as a charismatic Christian, and really my goal has been to look at spiritual gifts in this series outside of strictly a Christian context. So I started the series by doing some research on spiritual gifts, just, typing it into a Google search or the term spiritual gifts, or typing it into YouTube to see what would come up. And it was interesting to me that the term spiritual gifts is almost exclusively used, at least within our culture, within a Christian context, meaning that there are biblical references, biblical descriptions. There's a lot of material out there about helping people find their spiritual gifts. And I remember when I was a pastor doing a lot of teaching along these lines, and trying to create different programs and facilitate different avenues through which people could discover spiritual gifts, benefit from those gifts, and experience and operate in those gifts for themselves. And through that process, there was a lot of really amazing and wonderful things that happened and that people experienced that really was effectual and powerful and life-changing for people. And then in 2016, when I began to deconstruct, one of the things that I did, I've talked about this a lot on this channel, but one of the things that I did in 2016 was I began to look at other people who had different belief systems, had different, whether they were religious beliefs or spiritual beliefs or beliefs about the nature of the world, the nature of the cosmos is what I mean, the structure of it, and saw the same phenomenon with the same benefits, the same power, the same effectiveness that people with various different belief systems and approaches and ways of understanding these things operating in similar fashion. And then through study, began to notice that these phenomena that we call spiritual gifts was quite universal, not just today, not just people today operating in things like healing or miracles, or what we're going to talk about today, prophecy or psychic gifting, which I talked more about last week, words of knowledge, words of wisdom, things of this nature. And one of the questions that I got a lot, especially deconstructing within a charismatic context, was a lot of people that had some experience with spiritual gifts or had operated in spiritual gifts and found a lot of value in those things, deconstructing from the more toxic elements, more psychologically damaging elements of modern day Christian teachings, but still wondering about spiritual gifts. And so I want to talk today specifically about prophecy and prophets, and how that gift is not and has never been an exclusively Christian phenomenon. So I've spent a lot of time in the previous videos. I don't want to keep going over it, but we've been looking at 1 Corinthians 12, 13, and 14 as an accessible way of looking at how the Bible describes a phenomenon that not only we can be familiar with today, but that the people in Corinth that Paul was writing to, the church in Corinth, were already familiar with. And this is brought out in the very beginning of 1 Corinthians chapter 12, because Paul begins talking about, in our translations, it says, "Now concerning spiritual gifts, brethren, I do not want you to be ignorant." And I've talked about how the word spiritual gifts in the Greek is a Greek word, pneumatikos. And pneumatikos does not, primarily reference spiritual gifts like our translations would seem to indicate, but rather spiritual people. It's not talking about the phenomena, it's talking about the people who were consistently manifesting or operating these phenomena. And Paul is addressing this in his congregation or with the church at Corinth because they were familiar with these things. And so he opens up the chapter by talking about, let's see if I can find it here real quick. So he's saying concerning spiritual people, not spiritual gifts, concerning spiritual people, I would not have you to be ignorant. And then he says one of the most bizarre things in all of scripture, that in all the times that I taught about spiritual gifts or heard anything in a Christian context or a biblical context about spiritual gifts was never really addressed. But it's really unusual what he says here. He says, you know that you were, when you were Gentiles, you were carried away to these dumb idols, however you were led. So he's saying you have a reference for this type of phenomenon because you experienced the same kinds of things when you were Gentiles. And I talked about this more in my last video. But then he says this, he says, therefore I make known to you that no one speaking by the Spirit of God calls Jesus accursed, and no one can say that Jesus is Lord except by the Holy Spirit. That's an interesting phrase that Paul, who founded this church, you know, that we still derive our, in modern day Christianity, we still derive our teachings, our doctrines, our belief systems from a lot of what Paul the Apostle wrote. And yet here they had the man, access to the man himself. They had the fullness of his teachings. We just have fragments and remnants of what he taught. And yet he has to explain in a letter to the church that anyone speaking by the Spirit does not say that Jesus is accursed. Think about that for a moment. Now, my point here is not to, exegete the Bible, but simply to say that this was phenomenon that we find in the text itself. Also, we know historically that this type of thing was very common in the ancient world. Gifts of prophecy, words of knowledge, words of wisdom, even speaking in tongues was something that was common to the people in the ancient world outside of their Christian context. And so that's the main point that I'm trying to make. And here we find it within the text itself. And then Paul goes on and says, there are diversities of gifts, but the same Spirit. There are diversities of ministrations, but the same Lord. There are diversities of activities, but it's the same God who works all in all. Why is Paul saying this? He's saying this because essentially what's happening is that this phenomenon of spiritual gifts that was quite common to the people at Corinth and quite common to the ancient world, and as I'm making my thesis in this series of videos, quite common throughout human history, regardless of the perceptual filters that we use to explain the phenomenon, but it was understood that these gifts came from different gods. So, for example, I talked about Plato and Socrates and the concept of divine madness, and it came in 4 different capacities, one of those being prophecy specifically, and it was believed to have come from the god Apollo. But there were other phenomena that Plato describes, ritual madness, which was more which was inspired by Dionysus. So you have prophecy being inspired by Apollo in Plato's writings. You have ritual ecstasy or ritual madness, which is described as coming from the god Dionysus. And then you had poetic madness, which was described as being inspired by the muses. And you had erotic madness, which was inspired by Eros. So Paul is reframing all of this, and he's saying, yeah, there are different types of manifestations, there are different types of gifts, there are different types of administrations, but it's the same Spirit, the same Lord, and the same God. So he's taking the phenomena and framing it in a monotheistic way. And as we read this as modern believers or modern Christians or even just as modern people, our belief, and certainly the belief we had when we were in the charismatic church, was that these things were the exclusive property of the Trinity. So you can kind of see a Trinitarian view here. Differences of gifts, but the same Spirit. Differences of administrations, but the same Lord. And then differences of manifestations, but the same God. So Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. These are the exclusive property of monotheistic, specifically Trinitarian monotheistic religion. And so, if it's the exclusive property of those things, then these things can only come through the one God, the one Spirit, the one Lord. And so, Paul's for the congregation there again, as I said, he's reframing it away from these are manifestations that are occurring from Apollo and Dionysus and the Muses and Eros, but rather it's the same God working all of these things to benefit what Paul calls in these chapters the body of Christ. So, again, not to get lost in all of that or to make it feel like I'm giving a Bible lesson specifically, I'm simply using the Bible to talk about these phenomena and showing what's happening, or at least what I believe is happening actually in the text. Let me come back and just talk for a minute about this idea of divine madness, because this is super important to the rest of what we're going to talk about. And that was this identification among the philosophers that when someone is engaging with the divine realm or with what we call the spiritual realm, there is an element of madness to it. I believe it was Joseph Campbell that said the person in a episode of psychosis and the mystic swim in the same waters. In other words, the on the surface, the phenomena itself looks familiar. It looks the same. A person who's in psychosis or a person who's relating to the divine, on the surface, it looks the same. But as you dig deeper into that, the specific quality of the experience, and so therefore the nature of the experience is very, very different, but it is also very similar. And the point is that both phenomena, psychosis and divine madness or spiritual experiences, occur in states of consciousness that are altered from normal waking sort of states of consciousness that are primarily focused on sustaining physical life or sustaining biological life. Hopefully that makes sense. And if it doesn't, it'll hopefully make sense by the end of the video. So there's something else that is talked about in scripture and that Paul talks about, I believe, in his second letter to the church of Corinth. And that is what we would call today states of ecstasy. States of ecstasy. Ecstasy is an English word that finds its origins in the Greek word ekstasis. Ekstasis. And a simple literal translation of the word ekstasis means to stand outside one's self, to stand outside oneself. So that kind of would lead someone to believe, if we just took the most basic understanding or translation of the word ecstasis or definition of it, that whenever someone is experiencing spiritual phenomenon, they experience it as though they're standing outside themselves, sort of outside themselves, observing themselves do something that so there's an element of dissociation, if you will, in just the literal, simple translation and definition of the word ecstasis. And that doesn't quite get to the meaning of it. What it actually meant, the word ecstasis, what it actually meant back then, what it can mean for us today, is outside of the normal state of, again, consciousness that is designed to focus on the world out here, primarily to focus on threats that are out there so that we can stay alive, so that we can preserve elements that we might call evolutionary, right? So your fight or flight mechanism, for example, is part of the autonomic nervous system. And this is why people who suffer from anxiety attacks, intense episodes of anxiety, panic attacks, things like that, can be difficult to manage and difficult to treat because it's not part of something that we control consciously. It's something that's built into the autonomic nervous system. So the word autonomic obviously relates to something that's automatic. So these are things that our body does to keep us alive that we don't have conscious control over, because if for no other reason, that would be inefficient. So things like your breathing, things like your blood pressure, things like your digestion, all of this is controlled by the autonomic nervous system. And it's easy to see how that keeps us alive, right? We don't have to think constantly every moment to remember to breathe. We don't have to consciously sit there and think and activate something in order to digest our food. In the same way, threats then are treated as by the body, by the nervous system, as responding to threats is treated as essential to our survival as eating and breathing, right? So you're wired, the way the autonomic nervous system works is it governs attention. And then you're wired when there is a threat or a perceived threat to go into a fight or flight state chemically in your body in order to prepare you to survive, which means that it bypasses the more conscious functions of the brain, things like problem solving, cognition, logic, even imagination, and things like that, and just goes directly into the body to prepare you for survival. So that keeps us locked in, that keeps our attention locked into the physical world and into physical threats. So ecstasis or ecstasy would be an altered state of consciousness. Now, what's really fascinating is that these states of ecstasy, these spiritual states, if you will, can be mapped in the brain through brain scans, and they can look at which parts of the brain are active. You know, as they've looked at people in deep meditation, they looked at people who were speaking in tongues, they've looked at people in states of worship or prayer or heightened mystical states, and they map what's going on in the brain. And structurally, it's very, very different than your normal, just waking state of consciousness. It involves things like the parts of our brain that are more internally focused. So when we go inside to access memories, when we're daydreaming, when we're doing any of these kind of internal processes where we're shutting out our focus on the external world, the parts of the brain that are focused on the external world become less active, and the parts that are more involved with memory, imagination, and things like this become more activated. It also activates aspects of the brain that govern our sense of self. And so this is where the idea of ecstasis or standing outside yourself. So we have parts of the brain that help us to identify our localized our physical location, our relationship within our physical body. These are parts that would be active during athletic activities and stuff like that, where we're really focused on how our body is moving in space. And so there are alterations when people go into states of ecstasy, when they go into mystical states, when they go into states of meditation, states of prayer. Those things are activated in a different way so that someone's sense of self and I'm oversimplifying this, but I don't want to get into all the technical aspects of it because it's something I barely understand myself. So I'm not really qualified, I guess, to explain it in its technical terms. But it removes us from being focused on ourself, or what people would describe, the phenomena that people would describe often as transcending the ego, transcending the sense of self, getting outside of that. So not only were these philosophers and writers in the ancient world describing this phenomenon and describing it quite accurately, with today's technology and stuff, we can map the actual changes that take place within the brain. Now, this is where we get into how we interpret that phenomenon depends primarily on how we look at the nature of reality. So if somebody's strictly a materialist, in other words, they believe that the material universe, that which is localized, that which can be measured, that which can be observed, is the totality of the nature of reality, and that our consciousness is simply, our sense of self and all of that is simply a byproduct of these functions that are going on in the brain. They're going to look at those studies and they're going to say, see, people that are in states of ecstasy, mystical states, some kind of spiritual state, it's really just something that they're making up. It's something that their brain's creating. Their brain is creating the phenomenon. God is simply, the sense of God is simply something that the brain's doing and that we're experiencing as encountering or interacting with the divine. But of course, that's built on the assumption that all of our consciousness and everything is simply the byproduct of our biology. That's an assumption. There's another way of looking at this that says that we are primarily living in a spiritual reality, in a spiritual universe. In other words, what we see localized in time and space is not the complete and total description of all that is, or the complete and total description of reality. It's just a partial description, because at its core, reality is consciousness, if we want to pick a word that's more palatable to modern, the way we conceptualize the world in modern terms, or the fundamental nature of reality is spirit, and the fundamental nature of reality is spiritual. Now, I'm going to get a little bit into the weeds with this, a little bit more than I wanted to, but from my perspective, at least in observing the way that people talk about spirituality in pop culture, in the YouTube verse, in among other spiritual podcasts or spiritual teachers that are out there, there's sort of three alternatives. I've talked about how there's two alternatives in regards to atheism for a lot of people who deconstruct. There's the way of viewing the world from the perspective of God being a monarch. In other words, your Judeo-Christian, not Judeo-Christian, your Abrahamic faiths. So Judaism, Christianity, Islam primarily, and then all the various branches off of that, have sort of a ancient Near Eastern view of God. So in the ancient world, in the monotheistic Abrahamic religions, the way the spiritual world is mapped out, the way it's described, the way it's perceived and understood, corresponds to the political structure of societies and of human relationships back then. So primarily you had monarchs, you had rulers, right? You had kings, you had emperors, you had someone at the top of the society structure who was the authority figure, who was the ruler, who set and enforced the laws. And so that societal structure gets mapped onto the spiritual world and the spiritual realm, so that God is primarily understood in those terms. God is a ruler, Jesus is Lord, Jesus is King of Kings, right? And there are certain laws, there are moral laws, there are laws that are given from this divine image to govern the way that we conduct our lives and conduct our relationships within society. And so this God requires service. This God requires obedience. This God requires, uh, yeah, worship. That's the other word I'm looking for. Praise and worship and adoration, being the central figure. God is up here and we're all down here. And so the relationship is structured or understood. The relationship between the divine and the human is understood in these ancient Near Eastern monarchical, if you will, I don't even know if that's a word, but you get what I'm saying, terms where they took society, had these experiences, these phenomena, and then mapped it back onto the spiritual world, projected it literally into how that world structures. So how the spiritual world is structured. So if you were to look at other traditions, indigenous traditions, for example, shamanic traditions, more pagan, and when I say pagan, I'm meaning like uh, Wicca and sort of neo-paganism ideas about spirituality, they would map it differently. They would have the same phenomena of spiritual gifts, but they would map it differently, right? So in the spirit world, there would be animal spirits, there would be nature spirits. So nature religions, right? They don't map it in this monarch sort of way, but they have things like the Fey folk of the Celtics, or animal totems of the shamanic traditions. The spiritual world looks very much like the social world that they inhabited. So they're still having these phenomena, they're still having these experiences. A shaman would go into, and still do, go into altered states of consciousness, or shamanic journeys where consciousness is removed from, again, the localized biological need for survival, the normal waking state of consciousness, if you will, and is altered through drumming, sometimes through plant medicines and things like this, to experience the world out there. But again, the world out there is mapped or described in a way that's consistent with the societal structures. So it makes sense as we move, as we become more advanced, as information becomes more available to us, that these sort of monarch structures from the ancient Near East would stop making sense to people. And so that would kind of leave two alternatives for, I guess, most people. Either I believe in this monarch God that's out there in the sky that I'm relating to, who demands obedience, service, worship, praise, or I embrace the materialist view of Western progress and say then there can't be any God at all. There's only the two options, right? Again, that's taking what we understand as a society and mapping it out in the spiritual world. So from a Abrahamic religion perspective, we take the ancient Near East societal structure and map it onto the spiritual world. And so there's a God, King, Lord in the sky, right? That's over us, that we are then relating to. We are subservient to, we are other than, we are smaller than, all of that stuff. Or we take the secular view, which says that materialism is all there is, and so therefore there is no God and there is nothing out there to the spiritual world. The spiritual world does not exist, right? I was thinking about this. This doesn't quite work because of what happened at Fatima. But if you're Catholic, or you know about the vision that three shepherd children had, I think it was in like 1917, of Mary appearing. And then they said that Mary said she was going to give a sign to the world. And there were masses of people that showed up to view this sign. And it's known as the miracle of the sun. Light in the sky, the sun changing colors, I think descending to the earth, an object kind of moving around in the sky. And everybody said, that's Mary. Well, that phenomenon occurred in a part of the world that was almost exclusively Roman Catholic, right? And had already had devotion to Mary. But I want you to think about this. If a similar phenomenon happened today, let's say in America, where there was lights in the sky, dancing around, moving around, what would we say it was? Most people would start saying those are UFOs, right? Because our culture, since we went to the moon, has a perceptual filter, a perceptual map that says it's got to be aliens, it's got to be UAPs, it's got to be this kind of thing. So that's just an illustration for how much our perceptual filters provide the explanation for the phenomenon that we're experiencing. Now, back to this. There's a third option out there for people who can't quite embrace the humanist materialist predominant view, and they're done with the ancient Near East, the ancient view of the spiritual world. And so they tend to, or we tend to filter our concept of what's out there in the spiritual realm and in the spiritual world as being, I lost my train of thought. Sorry. It's just my brain skipped tracks. So we take what we think are Eastern ideas, Buddhist ideas, Hindu ideas, oneness ideas. So this is kind of a third option, that everything is part of the one, that all that really exists is Brahman, the ultimate unchangeable reality, which is one thing. And we are all just that one thing, sort of deceiving ourselves into the illusion that we are all separate. So the idea is that we are all one. There is nothing to relate to. If there's just one, a relationship by definition requires more than one. So if there is just one, then there's nothing to relate to. There's only the illusion of separateness. And the way we carry this illusion of separateness and experience it as human beings is through our ego, or the illusion that there is a self at all. So these frameworks for spirituality view enlightenment, real knowledge, the truth about reality, as there is nothing to relate to. You're it. Humanity is the divine playing a game of separation with oneself. And the goal is to realize there is no self, that any self at all is just illusion. It's all ego. And if we can dissolve the ego, we realize there's just oneness. This is different than what I would call a relational spirituality. So oneness says there is really nothing to have relationship with. It's all just one. And our spiritual progress, the terminus of our spiritual practices, meditation, whatever, is to dissolve the ego and to realize that everything is just one, and that you are what you have been looking for all along. So sometimes when some people are talking about I am, and they put it in all caps and they say, I realize that I am, they're speaking from this oneness sort of paradigm. But again, if there's just one thing, there's no relationship. There's a third option, though, that isn't really available to people, that I think best describes the nature of reality, not just the unseen, but the seen as well, the localized, the universe, the universe that we interact with, the universe that we all agree is there, right? Whether we think it's an illusion or not, we all agree that it's a real thing. But everything is relational because relationship is the core fundamental principle of reality. So in shamanic traditions, indigenous traditions, there are spirit guides. It's a very populated spirit world. There are uh, spiritual entities, nature spirits that exist on the normal plane. So there are oversouls, if you will, to various different, which are spiritual entities that govern the consciousness of the different species. So cats have a cat spirit that is an oversoul, or maybe it's a world populated with divas, or like the fae folk that I talked about, or nature spirits, elemental spirits, water spirits, fire spirits, stuff like that. On that plane, then there's a lower plane that's inhabited by other beings as well. And then there's an upper plane, which is inhabited by like angels, ascended masters, but all of the bottom line is all of it's relational. The monarch view of the world in monotheism is also relational. You're relating to the king, you're the servants, you're the subjects, etc., and so on. There is a third view that I guess is closer to the more is closer to the nature religions, that says that we are spiritual beings in relationship, living in a relationship based reality. So you can see this on the natural plane, right? The ecosystem, the way that life is balanced, even on this planet, exists in relationship, right? Just look at your trees, right? If they're going to bear fruit, they have to draw from the sun, they have to draw from the soil, they have to draw from the water. They have to be in relationship, in right relationship, if you will, with the environment in order to bear fruit. That's why coconuts don't grow in Colorado, or oranges or bananas, stuff like that, because the right relationship isn't there for those things to even exist. So I think there's a third way of looking at this where we can postulate that the spiritual world is relational, not one thing that just dissolves into this realization of oneness, but that there is a spiritual world, there is an unseen world, and there are relationships that can be formed in this unseen world. Now, Aaron, what in the world does any of this have to do with prophecy or with spiritual gifts? It has everything to do with it, because the pneumatikos that Paul talks about in 1 Corinthians 12, the spiritual people, the people who can manifest these things, are people who have developed their relationships in the spiritual world, so that, like the orange groves in Florida, they have learned how to flourish in a system of relationship that they have with that which exists in the spiritual realm. So this is an alternative spiritual practice that says, yeah, we're not going to use ancient societal maps of a monarch god to understand the spiritual world. We're not going to remove the reality of that place or that realm by adopting materialist assumptions and worldview, nor are we going to simply adopt a oneness view that is not after relationship, but is after dissolving into the one. But a third view that says, yes, the spiritual world, even God, is a separate entity the spiritual guides, the angels, whatever's out there are entities other than us. We may share the same essence. We may be made of the same stuff. We may all exist in one thing, in the sense that my body is one thing, your body is one thing, but all the cells in the body each are separate in the sense that they have specific jobs. Imagine if your lungs operated like your stomach, or your stomach like your lungs, like there would be no life. So life is held and sustained within a oneness, but a oneness that is based on relational capacities rather than a oneness that just dissolves into one thing. I hope that makes sense. Why am I saying this? Because I'm put in the description talking about the gift of prophecy. So prophecy as a phenomenon where someone else of a spiritual nature is speaking to and or through a human being. The most modern examples that we have of this outside of the Abrahamic religions would be a phenomenon known as channeling. So there are a lot of channeling works that have been authored specifically since the 70s. Jane Roberts, I think, who channeled an entity that she called Seth, would be an example of that. I think her name was the Reichert lady, who channeled Ra with the Law of One, or Jay-Z Knight, who channeled, can't remember the name, or Esther Hicks, who's channeling Abraham. Those would all fit the phenomenon of prophecy in the same way someone who claims to speak by the Spirit of God is channeling, if you will, information from the Holy Spirit or information from Jesus. The point is, this is not oneness. This is not, oh, Seth and Jane Roberts are the same being, or Esther Hicks and Abraham are the same being, but they are a human person, Jane Roberts, Esther Hicks, who have established an ongoing relationship with a spiritual being that identifies itself as Seth or identifies itself as Abraham, right? But there's distinction, there's definite distinction there. And the channeling then flows out of two things: to some degree, an altered state of consciousness, and an already established relationship with a spiritual being or with a spiritual entity. I hope that this is making sense. I hope this is making sense to you, because this is essential when we're talking about prophecy. So this was not the exclusive property of Christianity or of the Holy Spirit or of the Trinity. So in the ancient world, there's probably the most famous one is the oracle at Delphi, or Delphi. Not sure exactly how to say that right. Where there was a priestess who would enter into a state of ecstasy or enter into an altered state of consciousness and would get, really, as I understand it, just sort of babbling parables and symbols in this state that they would utter out. And then the priests of Apollo would take those statements and interpret them, and that interpretation would take the form as messages or oracles from the god Apollo, or that would be prophecy. Clearly, even in the Bible, you had other prophets. You had those that were speaking for Yahweh, the Old Testament prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and you have mention of the prophets of Baal, for instance, or what they would call false prophets, prophets where other gods were speaking through them. My point is, prophecy as a phenomenon, as a gift, even in the Bible, is not exclusively the property of the prophets of Israel. What's exclusive about them is that they're speaking for the one true God, right? They're speaking for Yahweh, but the phenomenon itself is the same. Even within Abrahamic religions today, you have um, Kabbalah, you have the Hasidic Jews, you have the Rebbes, who are prophets who are speaking for Yahweh. Christianity, maybe you aren't familiar with that. It seems like a hot mess right now, especially. But Jesus or the Holy Spirit is speaking through them. In Islam, obviously, Muhammad was a prophet, but he wasn't a Jewish prophet or a Christian prophet. Joseph Smith was a prophet. And so all of these things have unique qualities to them. So, what does that mean for us today? What does that mean for us today? How can that be important or beneficial to our lives today? Or is it something that's just too messy and we shouldn't mess with it? And we're just better off just getting with the secular program or something like that? What I think is important is that we can each establish, if we want to, this is not a mandate, but we can each establish relationships with Source, with God, with spirit guides that can speak to us, communicate with us, inform us, and possibly and hopefully improve our lives. That it is an innate, universal human capacity. So at the beginning of the video, I was talking about some of the evidence within neuroscience about the different faculties in the brain that are activated during mystical states or activated during states of ecstasy or ecstasis. Now, this is important. There are two ways of looking at this. The materialist, the scientist who's committed to a materialist worldview, who says there is no spiritual world. Everything that we experience is simply the creation of our brains. And we fool ourselves into thinking that we're experiencing these things because of the activity that's in the brain. God is in the brain. That's one way of looking at it that fits that worldview and that paradigm. It's taking the information and making it fit the assumptions of the worldview and the paradigm that we're viewing it from, if we're viewing it from a strictly naturalist or materialist perspective. Another way to look at this is to look at it from the relational view of the spiritual world and say that this brain activity that we're seeing when people are in these states are correlating to this experience. So in a sense, creating the experience, but not reduced down to the same thing as causing the experience. In other words, when someone is relating spiritually, this is how it appears in a brain scan as the person is experiencing the phenomenon. We would expect, because the person's experiencing it, they can talk about it and they can remember it, they can articulate it, and we have to use our brains for memory and for talking and for articulation. Then it makes sense that there would be that could be mapped on brain scans and things like this, right? That would make sense. But what we're saying is that it's not the cause of it. It is the effect. But here's the important part. Everyone has these capacities. Every human being has these capacities within their own neural networks, which means that every single one of us comes hardwired for spiritual relationship, and spiritual experience. That we don't have to say this is something innately to you as a human being from a strictly philosophical perspective that says the spiritual world is real, a God does exist, even if it's not an ancient Near Eastern monarch, even if it doesn't can't be reduced down to the pattern of an ancient Near Eastern monarch. That was simply the way that cultural assumptions perceived and filtered the phenomena or the relationship with God that they were experiencing, right? So it can't be reduced down to that. Um, but they were experiencing phenomenon. Nonetheless, they were just describing it in the best ways that they could. So every human being, so you see, that would be a philosophical assumption. God is the monarch in the sky, or the philosophical assumption that you're a spirit and you're relating to a spirit. And so therefore, because you're a human being, you have the capacity, and we're making only a philosophical statement. And by philosophical statement, I mean a statement of what we believe to be true based on logic, but we don't have hard, tangible, localized, observable evidence for it. When we look at what's happening in the brain and say, yeah, the structure of spiritual experiences, the structure of meditation, the structure of speaking in tongues, the structure of mystical experience, the structure of deep states of mystical experience, ecstasy, prayer, prophecy, things like this. When it shows up in brain scans, it activates a very specific pattern within the brain and within the neural system. And we all have those capacities within ourselves. Then what we're looking at is very tangible, observable evidence that every single one of us is wired for these capacities. So every one of us is wired to become a pneumatikos, to become someone who establishes and develops relationship with what's out there. Now, is this a dangerous thing for us to do? After all, Joseph Campbell said that a person in a state of psychosis and a person in a mystical state are swimming within the same waters. The ancient philosophers called it divine madness. Here's someone who's out of their minds. Are there inherent dangers? Are there inherent risks? And I'm going to say 100% yes. There are inherent dangers and there are inherent risks. And this is why I think a spiritual path for contemporary people is super important, because if we have certain levels of instability within our own psyche, if we have a lot of unfinished business, a lot of unresolved trauma, a lot of resentment, a lot of spiritual bypassing that's part of our psyches that we have not stabilized or organized, if we're very fragmented on the inside, then is it possible that we can end up relating to something that really is nothing more than something that is the byproduct of that instability? In other words, one of the things that happened for me when I had this, visionary experience that I've talked about a lot on this channel that caused me to really question and move away from the dogmatic Christian faith that I was giving fidelity to for most of my life. When I had this experience in 2016, the first element of it was I heard, was in one of these states, and I was having a visionary, dreamlike type experience while I was awake. And I heard a voice in this experience that said, if you don't, integrate your shadow, you don't integrate those parts of yourself that you're unconscious about that are operating within your life. If you don't integrate those things, you will mistake the voice of your shadow for the voice of God. So is there truth when people are out there saying, well, when people are saying they're relating to Jesus or they're relating to something out there in the spiritual world, really it's just a split off part of themselves. They're describing a phenomenon that can actually happen. And they're doing it really from a Jungian approach, Carl Jung, and the idea of the shadow self being an unconscious part of us that we don't recognize. And so can those unconscious parts of us then aren't integrated present themselves to us as something other than us, something separate from us, sort of like a imaginary friend. But I don't like that because I think a lot of imaginary friends, the kids that had imaginary friends, were just interacting with their own spirit guides. But it's something that really is a part of us that's split off, that we perceive as other than us, but is really just a part of us. That's absolutely fair critique. The problem that I have is that we will take that one critique and we will escalate it to, or we will generalize, let me say it that way. We'll take that one aspect of this where a person is maybe relating to a split off part of themselves, thinking it's a spirit entity. That is a very real possibility and a real phenomenon. But then we generalize and say, everyone who's having these experiences, anyone, anywhere who had this experience was really just relating to their shadow self, was really just relating to a split off part of themselves. And then we extrapolate that to everybody else as our way of understanding their own experience. And we say, well, you didn't really experience a visitation of Jesus. That was a split off part of yourself. You didn't really experience an encounter with something other out there that's a real entity that has an existence independently of you. You really just experienced a part of yourself and didn't know it was you. And so real spiritual growth and real benefit comes from recognizing that and integrating that into yourself. That can be true for some, and in some instances, and it's not all or nothing, even in that, with that person. For someone to become a real pneumatikos, a real prophet, a real channeler, they have to do the internal work of shadow work and integrating the parts of themselves so that their messages and their relationship becomes more clear and more pure. We do the same thing in human relationships. The definition of clinical narcissism is narcissistic personality disorder, is a disorder in which the person has difficulty or even fails at developing relationship with the real person out there. All they're relating to is their perception, their image of who they think that person is or who they want that person to be. And so the way that shows up in their external relationships is they're confused between what the technical term for it in psychology is the introject, the internal image that I have of that person, and the way I think about them in my brain is the other person. It's to confuse the map, which is my neurological mapping, my memory, the images, the ideas that I have about the person with the person themselves, and to say what I think about them and how I picture them and how I image them is actually who they are, or at least how they're supposed to be. So the narcissist manages their relationship with the person by trying to make them fit that idealized image that they have of them. And when they don't fit that idealized image, they gaslight the person, they ridicule the person, they attack the person, they try to manipulate the person to get them to fit their perception of what that person should be. So we can do the same kind of thing, and maybe it's even easier to do this in relationship with spiritual things, spiritual beings, spiritual entities. So if the relationship's going to become healthy, if the relationship's going to become pure, then we have to be aware of our own unfinished business. We have to we have to do the shadow work to integrate the shadow self so that we can be a clear and pure channel, so that what's coming is actually what's coming, rather than we're projecting onto reality or onto that being what we think that it is supposed to be and how it is supposed to act. So it's very important that we do that kind of work. Second thing I want to address, not everything that's out there is meant for your benefit. In other words, a person can make contact with a spirit being, can make contact with something out there in the spiritual world, even establish relationship with something out there in the spiritual world, but it's not necessarily for their highest good. It's not necessarily benevolent. So there's an element of discernment. And so people would argue and say, well, you could end up developing a relationship. So, for example, from the Christian perspective, because Father, Son, and Spirit is the origin and the sole source of all of these phenomenon that we're talking about when we're talking about spiritual gifts. Anything other than that is demonic. Anything other than that is malevolent, regardless of how it presents or appears to be, right? So, uh, this kind of spiritual, so the church made us afraid of anything that's out there that doesn't fit with whatever is described in the Bible, for example. And so the Bible becomes the standard of discernment, right? So you could say, well, Aaron, if you're encouraging people to establish and develop these relationships, which they have innate, even biological capacities in their brain and nervous system for, then they could possibly be misled by spirits that don't have their highest good or trickster spirits and things like that. That is also very much a reality. But before we get too freaked out about that, I want you to think about this. That's true in the world too. That's true with everybody that you meet. How many people that you meet have real integrity and are who they present themselves to be? How many people out there are relating to people in a transactional sort of way, just trying to get something from them or something for them? How many con artists are out there? How many sociopaths or psychopaths are out there? How many narcissists are out there? So just navigating relationships with people has some of those same inherent risks, and yet, we know for a fact that having healthy relationships leads to longevity, that having community and social support is essential to mental and emotional well-being. And so we would never encourage someone, hey, look, there's stranger danger out there. There's bad people in the world, so you should just cloister yourself and keep yourself away from all human contact and from all human relationship. Of course, we wouldn't do that. It would be ridiculous to do that. Instead, we try to, uh, warn our kids about the dangers that are inherent in human relationships, but so they can navigate those relationships. The purpose is so you can navigate the relationship, not so that you can isolate yourself and insulate yourself and protect yourself from all damage and from all harm that could come to you, right? So I don't think it's wise to take that approach and say, well, just don't mess with this stuff because you could get misled and you could, meet dark entities. And so, I mean, there's so much fear that's been projected and injected by the church into people about these kinds of phenomenon, right? But I'll tell you what I discovered when I went from, because I did, man, when I first started encountering these things from a Christian perspective, I'm like, oh, this could all just be demons. The first time I went and got a tarot card reading, I said to myself, I might get a demon off of doing this, but I'm going to give it a shot. I'm not going to take somebody else's word for it. I'm going to be like the kid, the rebellious kid that has to learn for themselves. If you don't listen to me, life will eventually teach you, that kind of thing. And I remember legitimately saying to myself, well, if I get a demon, I know lots of people that can cast it out, and I know the signs and symptoms to look for and stuff like that. And that was almost 10 years ago. And although there are a lot of people that would say, well, yeah, see, Aaron, he was taken off course by deceiving spirits and whatever. I've not seen the fruit of that in my life at all. So the last thing I'll leave you with, the last thing I'll leave you with here is that there is an element of discernment that we need to have. But I think a couple of principles that I could share with you just real quickly, because I'm getting to the end here, that are good safeguards for us is number one, if we dismantle authoritarian hierarchy as being an innate aspect of the spiritual world, of our concept of reality, right? Um, so the monarch, we're relating to the monarchical God. Our personal agency is a problem. Our free will is a problem. It is not fundamentally good. In other words, all sin happens because we have free will. Um, this idea of not my will, but thy will be done, right? That your personal agency, your personal sovereignty is the problem. If we reframe that and we say it's essential to well-being and it's a component that is built into our experience as human beings on purpose, uh, for a lot of different reasons that I don't have time to go into here, but not none of them being problematic, none of them being what leads us into sin. But your personal agency is fundamental. Then any contact with anything, whether it's a split off part of your unconscious or a genuine spiritual encounter with a spiritual reality or being or person, let's just call them that, spiritual person that has a existence independently of you. In other words, it exists out there whether you existed or not. So it's not a split off part of you. Um, so there is no hierarchy. There is no authority that's higher for you than your own personal agency or your own personal sovereignty. And that must be respected and that must be protected. Then the very first red flag is when you're encountering something out there that is trying to usurp or coerce or take over or manipulate your choices that you get to make in this life. In other words, spiritual guides are there to give us a broader perspective. They're there to share with us information. They're like good friends, right? A good friend will speak truth to you. A good friend will openly share their opinion with you. A good friend will maybe even give you advice. But a good friend will not sit there and think they know better for you than you know for yourself. A good friend will not transgress that boundary. A good friend, if you don't take their advice and it doesn't work out, does not come back to you and say, "See, I told you so. If you would have just followed my advice, you'd be okay." A good counselor doesn't really counsel and give advice in a way that seeks to usurp the agency and sovereignty of the person. So anytime there's pressure, anytime there's guilt, anytime there's shame, anytime there's uh, flattery, uh, something telling you how great and wonderful you are, not in a way that makes you feel valued and whole, but in a way that makes you feel inflated and superior, if that makes sense, is probably just engaging in a manipulative form of flattery. So anytime you encounter those energies, anytime you encounter those feelings, those should be red flags. So that'd be the first thing I'd say. And then the last thing I would say is the proof of the pudding is in the eating. That's why Paul's not addressing spiritual gifts, one-time manifestations that happen through people. You know, one time I prayed for somebody and I felt healing flow through my hands and that person got well. And I don't know how it happened and it never happened before and it never happened since. That would be a spiritual gift. But even in the text, Paul's addressing, you know, spiritual people. So it's by reason of use. It says in the Bible in another place that we become capable of discerning good and evil by reason of use or by reason of practice. Another place says, taste and see that the Lord, he is good. So uh, there's an element of longevity to this stuff, right? So is what you're doing working? We want to be extremely pragmatic. So two things that I would leave you with. Number one is honoring your own and taking responsibility for your own personal agency as a divine human, as a human that is divine, that does have source energy and connection with source and is made of the source of source stuff, that is eternal, that is an aspect of source, but not the totality of God. So you honor that. And then number two, is what you're doing working? Are you getting intuitive hits that are protecting you? Are you getting intuitive hits that are getting you where you want to go in life, getting you where you choose to go in life? Is it supporting your goals? Is it working tangibly for you? I mean, if we taught a form of energy healing and there was never any results, that could be verified and have some track record of stability and repeatability to it, then we would need to change methods, right? Because it's not working. We wouldn't sit there and just justify, well, that's how it is. And it didn't work because of this, and it didn't work because of that. At some point, we have to be honest and say, this isn't working. I need to try something different. I need to try a different approach. So those are two things, just two very basic things. There's more to it, and you could build whole courses on these things. But at the end of the day, it's safe for you, right? Just have some wisdom, honor your own agency, do your own shadow work, and most importantly, be pragmatic. How is this working? And don't be dogmatic. Dogmatic says this is the truth, no matter how it works out. This is the truth, and we're obligated to give fidelity to it. Pragmatism versus dogmatism. Pragmatism says, how is this practically working? And if it's not working, we discard it and look for something else. So that's the difference between pragmatism and dogmatism. So my advice would be, don't be dogmatic, honor your own agency, and don't be afraid. And anything that makes you feel pressured, anything that makes you feel less than, anything that isn't leading to a sense of wholeness on the inside, to a sense that you have immense value as an individual and a person, anything that seeks to gaslight you and tell you, no, your experience wasn't this, it's something else. And I know better than you about your experience, even though I didn't experience it. That's really not helpful advice at all. So with all of that, I hope this was helpful for you. I wasn't able to see comments. I'll try and go back and look at them, but I hope you enjoyed it. Let me know in the comments. If you're watching my replay, let me know that you watched my replay. I appreciate you spending this time with me. I really do. Your time is your most valuable resource. Those of you that have been supporting us financially and giving gifts, I really appreciate that as well. Looking forward to doing some things in the future. We're planning a retreat, a little mini weekend retreat in the spring that we'll be letting you know about in the upcoming days and weeks. We're also planning a longer summer retreat. We'll let you know about that as well. I'll be doing a Zoom call on January 3rd, bravely sharing what I'm calling, a little bit tongue-in-cheek, a prophetic word, but something that was given to me by Spirit for 2026, that I think, whether you believe that it came from another source or not, I think will be very practical and very helpful for you. So I hope you'll join me for that. That's information is pinned at the top of my Facebook page. If you're watching on YouTube, you can find me on Facebook. You can also join the New Day Global private Facebook group, where occasionally we release other content and stuff like that. And there will be some changes coming soon. Been spending the last half of this year getting some plans. I've got some books that I'm getting ready to publish. So there are a lot of things that, though they haven't manifested outwardly yet, that your gifts and contributions have given me the ability to work on and progress towards. And so I really, really appreciate that. And we're going to be talking more about the relational structure of reality. We'll be talking about relationships with spirit and how to relate to spirit in a way that is resourceful and provides you with resources that you can bring into your life in order to get to where you choose to go and where you want to go in your life, to manifest what you want to manifest, the type of life that you're seeking, and also resources that can help you heal physically, mentally, emotionally, and get through very trying and very difficult circumstances in your life. So those are some things that are coming up. If you're interested in knowing more, please reach out to me. And I appreciate everyone who has supported. And again, even if you've just taken your time, even if this is the first time that you've watched me or seen me, I appreciate you sharing your most valuable resource with me, which is your time. God bless you, and I will definitely see you next